Well, why don't I just kind of like orient us a bit to what this chat's going to be about for anybody that's jumping in and joining us, and then yeah, we'll just get right into it. Introduce
Yeah.
ourselves, and yeah, cool. So I saw your, I mean, I don't know if it's at viral status, but I saw your piece about the Kiss Cam
Mm.
and absolutely loved it. Like it brought out my most nerdiest people. Some people get excited about bands. I get excited about writers that I love. And so I read it and yeah, I just thought, okay, this guy's onto something. And then I went in your publication and I read more pieces, and I saw your framing about the Guardians of Decay and like a few other things that just really, I was like, this guy is super smart, seeing really interesting things and putting a lens on them that I don't often see. I think a lot of us are making maybe similar observations, but I find your lens really interesting. And so I just reached out and I sent you a little note and I was like, I love your stuff. And then you're like, great, let's let's have a conversation. And so
It's great to know that we have fans even north of the border, north of our border, south of your border. But it's funny. I've had a lot of Canadians as subscribers. You know how you can look in to see where your
mm,
map, like and I had 49 states. The only one was Nebraska, and we ended up now having we have people in Nebraska now, so we have all 50 states covered, and then we're global in our reach, and then of course Canada's been a big part of that too. So
yeah, cool.
greetings from down south.
Yeah, welcome. We're very happy to have you. And I actually, interestingly, my deepest segment is in the States, which I find really interesting.
Ah,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
it's okay down here. We like it.
We're just keeping relations good, throughout this tariff stuff will demonstrate that we can still be good neighbors.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll just make sure that
So,
the Stanley Cup stays on this side of the border too. So,
okay, agree to disagree.
all right. Well, but it's funny, even though it's on this side of the border, all the players are Canadians. Just
Yeah,
about.
it's maybe
Anyway.
the only thing we got on you guys when it comes to athletics.
Well, I remember my first ever hockey game, but I remember saying to my dad, like, my dad, Wayne Gretzky's Canadian. Like all these guys are from Canada, like all of them, like literally all of them are from Canada, except for like a handful. But and then the handful that weren't, maybe they were from like Minnesota or something like that. But then the wall fell down, and then then all the Russian players and the Czech
Hmm.
players came over. So here we are.
Here we are. Yeah, awesome. Well, it's nice to share that with you. And
Yeah,
speaking of sharing, why don't, if you're up for it, do you want to say a little bit about who you are and maybe how you experienced the beginning of our connection as well, and then I can
yeah,
do likewise, and we'll get into our chat.
yeah. Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Of course. Manhattan greetings to everybody that's tuning in. I write the Substack, The Whirl of Reorientation. I started it about 2 years ago. Um, in that process, my business partner and co-host of the podcast, the No Way Out podcast, which I also co-host and co-created with my collaborative partner Ponch Rivera, Brian, call sign Ponch. He was a Navy jet guy. We're the two of us are two of the four owners of our company called AGLX, which is an adaptive strategy firm. We teach adaptive strategy. So much of what you're seeing and reading on my articles are, some form of what we teach leaders and teams in person in our business relationships. A lot of it stems on or flows from the theories of John Boyd, who was extremely influential to me as a Marine officer when I was in the Marine Corps when I first learned of him, to Ponch as a naval aviator. And years ago, Ponch and I connected because I saw him on LinkedIn or something. I'm like, who's this guy writing about John Boyd from the same way that I'm thinking about John Boyd? And what I mean by that is John Boyd is most often misunderstood and reduced to things that he didn't say, or very simplified versions of things that he did say but completely misinterpreted. And what I realized about what Ponch was writing was that he was coming at it from more of an authentic view. And the view that I thought that I was extracting was from firsthand sources, from people who had known John Boyd, who had worked with John Boyd and collaborated with him. And that's how Ponch and I initially started our connection. And then eventually I wound up going into business with Brian, in the firm that he had started a few years before. And, we've been kind of constantly collaborating on how we think about these things. And it's not limited to John Boyd. There's a lot of other stuff. Ponch is the co-author of a book called The Flow System that he wrote with Nigel Thurlow and John Turner. And it's Boyd's in it and Boyd's theories are in it. But to sum it up, it's really about their consulting experience of trying to create flow states within organizations. And that's ultimately what Boyd was trying to do, was get people to a state of flow so that they could make sense of what was going on in their unfolding reality effectively, fast, and act and learn on that, and then continue to relearn as they go, more effectively than competitors. Or a lot of the places that I coach, this is in competitive situations to help people identify opportunities and gaps a lot faster than they would if they didn't know this stuff. But it includes other thinkers too. So you've probably seen on the site, there's speaking of Canada, there's quite a bit of Marshall McLuhan on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I there's another Substacker, John Robb, who writes the Global Gorillas that I highly recommend. Global Gorillas Report. Gorillas like warfare, like guerrilla, not gorilla the ape. But John, I had read something that John had written back, I want to say 18. It was called McLuhan at War. And one of the things that I had figured out with Boyd stuff was that all the concepts and principles that I had learned in the Marine Corps were actually a systems approach to complexity that were not limited to the military. And a lot of it was discovered there, but a lot of it was discovered there because of the adverse, nonlinear, complex situations that we find ourselves in the military. So a lot of very valuable things that could be applicable anywhere are discovered there. So what I started doing, the bulk of my career was around asset management, and I was in the asset management business, and I was teaching this to people, anybody that would listen, because I thought it was a more effective way to sell stuff, to get people to understand concepts that were applicable to all, that they could use to help their businesses get better. And I had this thesis that you didn't have to be in the military to really embrace and understand these things. So I like to think that we're on the right path with it, because some of our best students have never come close to to spending any time in the military. And that's really what we think is John Boyd's corpus of work is actually pointing us towards that. Like, how do we deal with complexity in a broader universal scale? Same with Marshall McLuhan, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Friedrich Hayek, and others that we talk a lot about. That these concepts are not only universal but teachable, and we try to distill it into format like what you've encountered on our website and on our podcast, to put it in a way that, hey, if you're paying for this and you're getting it or whatever, you're tuning into the podcast, wherever you are, you should be better off if you had not encountered this stuff, if you had not listened to it. That's ultimately the goal. And we tell people very candidly, if your competitors are learning this stuff and you're not, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because that's ultimately what this is teaching, is how to leverage one's cognitive understanding of the world, how to leverage it within your environments faster and more effectively than the people that you're competing with.
Mm-hmm.
So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And it actually gives you a perfect segue to kind of like bridge into the stuff I do, and why I got so excited by your stuff is because a few, complexity science and systems change and all these things, you can approach them from so many different angles and lenses. And I have worked sort of, I'm almost 20 years now into working on this sort of, if I had a thesis, it would be you transform people to transform systems, and it's got to be in like reciprocal relationship. And so I've spent almost 20 years, I'd say, working on how do we transform the systems of work and learning And I
Hmm.
started my career at a university and I was like a huge nerd throughout that period. And I was so struck by the fact that you were taking these theorists that I was reading in undergrad and making them hyper relevant and taking their insights, which academics is something really interesting about academics is they're kind of um, prophets in a sense because they're thinking so deeply and observing so deeply about the world in a sort of data backed way that
Hmm.
they're often 20 years ahead. And so you can use even 30 years ahead. And so you can use these theories and apply them as you have. But I've rarely seen people do that. And I've like taking theory and academic constructs and sort of letting them out in a wild and a highly effective way. And I come at this stuff through a sort of combination of system science and innovation models, social innovation specifically. I spent the first chunk of my career at a university in an innovation lab at the business school. And we were doing predominantly social impact work, and that's a much softer space. And so when I encountered you and you're coming at it through a lens of a history in the military and with just a very different language, but saying very similar things. It was just, it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I also really appreciate the way that you speak about learners and the way that you speak about, I guess we could call it like a process of lifelong learning, because that's
Hmm.
also a huge passion of mine. And something that's kind of in the works for me right now is we're still putting the finishing touches on it, but I'm about to join my friend's company as the director of learning and transformation to
Ah.
really start to like hone our models around how do you create both people and culture change.
Mm.
And it's a really, I think the more of us doing this work, the better. And one of the things that I observed that I'd like to sort of ask you to reflect on after is
Yeah.
we are living through the way I language it is like an historic transformation. Like this isn't, for my life, I'm an old millennial, and I feel like for my entire life, all I've ever been hearing about is change and the pace of change and volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments and all of this kind of stuff. And um, that's not going away. That's speeding up. The data that I look at, the patterns that I read, I would say this is like a massive turning in society. It's not just technology, it's not just social systems, it's not just culture, it's all of it at the same time. It's sure AI is a huge factor, but it's multifactorial. And I find that you provide this orientation to that sort of our situation, if you will. You help people orient to the reality as it exists. And I think what I see a lot in organizations, and often can't even work with, say, like an enterprise organization, is they've solidified their mindset to 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And so I think one of the things you do, and I know I try to do, is like, how do we bring people into this present moment to understand the scope, scale, speed, and give the practices and the tools and the frameworks and the sort of the glasses, if you will, that people can put on to understand where they are, because you've got to make very different strategic decisions when you're operating in environments like this. And so I think, yeah, I know that's a pretty wide invitation, but if you want to pick up any of those threads, I'd really like to hear how you relate to this moment and how you help the people you work with do that too.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, neither one of us is short on things to think about or say.
No, I'd say so. I'll start with sort of what I call like I don't know, kind of like my personal rules or whatever that I've learned. And my background, I mean, you kind of hit on it. Like I consider myself to be extremely multidisciplinary. And I was educated by Jesuits at university and in grad school. Before that, I had Lasallian Christian Brothers, and I went to an all boys school, and they did a really good job of forming you their way, which was conforming you to rules and regulations. And I had some great outlets, like I enjoyed my literature classes, and I was a lacrosse player. Um, but there was a structural rigidity around it, and I remember the guidance counselor telling me, he's like, "You got two options. you're clearly going to be a military officer. You know, my dad had been one. At the time, he was still serving. You know, it was something in the family, and he says you got two options. He's like, you're either going to go to a service academy like your dad did. My dad went to West Point. He's like, or you're going to have to do ROTC at a Jesuit school. And the reason that you have to go to Jesuit school is because the way your mind works, we have not been able to completely break you. Like, I, you know, that wasn't a direct quote, but I think that's what he meant. Like, I wasn't completely broken. Um, and what I guess what I found out that, like, they would make us read The Old Man and the Sea, but then I'd find out, like, about Hemingway, like the person, and I would start reading books like by A. E. Hotchner, like Papa Hemingway, and other things, like to learn about his life, or Death in the Afternoon about bullfighting, which was interesting to me. You know, having Hispanic origin and all this other stuff, and I started realizing that, like, I'm doing all this extra work, like I'm doing
Mm.
extra shit on top of what they make me do, which was, you know, with that school, college was like standing on my head, blindfolded with two hands tied behind my back, based off of high school, because, you know, high school prepared us so well for everything else. I even thought the Marine Corps was fairly straightforward versus I was totally prepared for it by going to high school with the Italian Christian Brothers. But anyway, um, it was the Jesuits that really opened my mind up to thinking, learning how to have independent thought, learning how to have multidisciplinary thought, and the way that the ratio, they call it the ratio studiorum, the way it's set up is that you're totally formed as a human, and you sample basically everything. So even if you're an engineer, you're still getting literature courses and philosophy and theology and other things. And I chose the liberal arts path. I had a what we what's called our Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is another way that the military of the United States sources its officers. I had a scholarship to college, so I knew what I was doing when I graduated. I knew that I'd be a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. So in the meantime, I thought, well, I'm only going to study. You know, I know what job I'm going to get. I don't have to worry about, like, accounting, or, you know, like a lot of the other people were worried about, like, you know, getting a job on the other end of college. I already knew what my job was, so long as I stayed out of trouble and I had good grades and I stayed healthy. So I'm going to study what I love, and it was history, a lot of English, Spanish, other things. But my undergrad degree is actually in history. And then my master's is in economics, and it was also from a Jesuit school, but still that same kind of, like, total formation approach, of having, um, you know, being very multidisciplinary. I think the other thing I started to learn from the Jesuits, and then amplified by John Boyd and Marshall McLuhan and Friedrich Hayek, is, like, you don't know everything, and
Mm.
what you think you know actually might not be true. And the movie The Big Short has the best quote at the beginning. They attribute it to Mark Twain or Will Rogers. It's like, it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you're absolutely convinced of that turns out not to be true. So I really learned how to let go of things and try to overcome biases. And that's where Boyd came in eventually. That's where it became a natural fit. Like, you have to constantly reorient and update and revise your system, your cognitive operating system. And at that point, you realize that some of the things that you thought were true and you were certain of turn out not to be. And then you realize that you were being oriented synthetically by something else, not by your own work, your own research, your own experience in the world. Which, again, that goes back to what the Jesuits taught me. Teilhard de Chardin, who I mentioned, who was an influence to Boyd. Boyd read his book, The Phenomenon of Man. He was a Jesuit priest, so he would have been very versed in that. But, like, that kind of radical acceptance, or maybe not radical acceptance, but, like, you know, like this radical pursuit of truth, no matter where it takes you, that you have to overcome your biases and the way you think. Which, as Boyd has shown us, that's really hard to do, because we all come from some place and we all have backgrounds, and I mean, you get at the beginning of our conversation, we were kind of hitting on some of those. You know, I'm in the States, you're in Canada. You know, the Stanley Cup hasn't been in a Canadian team since, like, you know, whatever, the 90s and what have you. But but all of that is basically orientation from our biases, our cultural traditions, our genetic heritage, and other things, which Boyd talked about, all it is shaping a series of facts that we can objectively look at and come up with completely different conclusions.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah.
So,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, but that's one of the things I learned is like you have to be able to let go of things quick, and you have to always be moving and reorienting your mind, because what you think is right might not be right, might be wrong.
Yeah, you said, especially in this particular moment, a lot of people talk about this era as being post-truth. It's a very messy time to try to figure out what is determined real from fiction. And also just the speed in which knowledge creation is moving is so, so fast. And I think having that humility is a key strength, capacity, whatever we want to call it. I know later we're going to try to talk a little bit about the capacities that are needed to be in times like these. And also, I just want to go back to a couple of things that you said. Number one, The Big Short is one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, it's awesome. Huh? Yeah.
It's so good. I've seen it so many times. Um, yeah, I absolutely love when culture takes something that most people are, think is like boring news or whatever, and take it and really, show it to us in a way that we want to pay attention to. I think it's super smart. And, but yeah, so cool to know we share that. And, you said, I can't remember if I got your quite words right, but you were talking about cognitive operating systems and synthetic something, which I took to put together as sort of the way in which we don't really realize. The way I talk about it is like cultural operating systems. Like, just our computer has an operating system, culture is an operating system, and culture is a set of values. It's like basically the source that we don't often realize is dictating our behaviors, choices, values, actions. It's like the programming that we give to humans, and we practice culture. That's how we make it
Mhm.
real. We make it real through our actions. The actions are downstream of your beliefs and your values and those
Mhm.
cultural inputs. And so the words you were using to me were just a different way of expressing that. And I just wonder about like what mechanisms you see of how do we update the operating system? What have you seen in your practice about what actually shifts people at that root level? And for me, when I think about transformation, I differentiate it from change. So I see change as being sort of incremental steps you take toward. Um, a really good analogy would be, say, like working out, right? You want to get like the beach body. The beach body is only a transformation if you go from a before state to an after state. It's like a fundamental change. Whereas change to me is all of the various things you do to get to the transformation. And a lot of people stop at the change part. They stop
Mhm.
when it gets too hard, or they stop when there's too many barriers, or when they're not getting progress fast enough. And so that's a really, tangible example. But thinking about mindset and the ways in which we replicate culture out in the world, what have you seen about how we don't just change our beliefs and our values and our actions, but we actually transform them into different outcomes?
All right. So again, a lot to unpack there. So I, as
Just some softballs for you, Mark.
I pulled out 5 different topics that I talk about a lot.
Mm,
So I'm trying to think of like which. Well, first thing we'd say is like systems drive behaviors, right?
mm,
Whether I created the system or whether a system was created by somebody else, all systems drive behaviors, and that was a big thing. You have the article that you came into contact with, the Kiss Cam, and that was my point in the article. It wasn't about the personal marital scenarios of the people involved. It was about the decisions that got them there, the medium that got them there at a concert, and how it became global news, blah 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 blah. All of that is systems driving behaviors, right? That's
mhm,
that's that's a that's a fundamental that's a fundamental tenet of a lot of what we talk about. We say it all the time on the podcast. Ponch says it probably more than I do, and it's true that so often we're looking at symptoms and we're not looking at systems, or we're looking for prescriptions, but we're not really looking at anything that's going to inherently change a system. And that was again some of the other comments or some of the other articles that I had around that topic of the Kiss Cam around public relations and human resources and other things, those systems aren't going to fundamentally change. So guess what? This will happen again. And as technology continues to evolve the way it has, that's another thing that's going to happen. Oh, I know, that reminded me of another thing that you said. I'm just going to make a note about.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and this will bring it back to McLuhan. So make the people in Canada happy that one of their own is a massive. McLuhan's a massive influence on me. Massive.
Yeah.
Probably not as much as Boyd, but
Do you
close.
want to, sorry, can I interrupt you a quick sec? Can you, for
Yeah.
anyone who doesn't know, can you just say like who is Boyd and who is McLuhan, and like in like one
Yeah.
sentence, what is their kind of primary contribution?
So thanks to John Robb, I I never had thought of combining the both of them, and then now I find that I spend all my time doing everything I can to combine the both of their thoughts. But starting with John Boyd, John Boyd was a strategist that was deeply influential on the organization that I came from, the United States Marine Corps, and what he helped the Marine Corps do after the Vietnam War was reimagine itself in the sense of being an organization that um, could be more decentralized, that could flow, that can operate more with a maneuver, what we call a maneuver mindset versus an attrition force on force mindset. And that engagement, that sort of consulting engagement, if you will, of John Boyd on the Marine Corps, that was the product of years and years and years of autodidactic learning by Boyd, to the point where he created a theory, discovered a theory that informs all fighter design. It's called fighter plane design. It's called energy maneuverability theory. And then in the uh, late 60s, early 70s, he started to wonder, how is it that I came up with energy maneuverability theory? And that sent him down a very monastic academic journey that lasted till his death in 1997, of trying to figure out how it is that we improve our capacity for free and independent action as humans, as individuals with an orientation, which in turns makes us sense or empowers us to sense more effectively, to make decisions more effectively, and to act on those decisions more effectively.
Mhm.
Um, and for example, I see that Mark Petrie had put a comment and it says the OODA loop is a very valuable model, and I think that that's most people's starting point on what John Boyd is talking about. But it's a starting point that you can't limit the thinking on. It's not nearly enough. In fact, I tweeted about that today. I could throw the tweet in the thread to my current article, that if you're thinking that the way that we're taught these things is is basically wrong by and large. Even when I was in the Marine Corps, I wasn't taught it the way that I understand it now. I had to do a lot of independent thinking and learning on that, and that's really what Boyd did. And it's sort of his example that I follow there. He really became, he's known as a fighter pilot, and he's known for all these other things that he did. But his true canon, his true value, and everything that he actually did takes place after he retired from the Air Force, where he became very influential on not just the Marine Corps, but on the defense reform movement, on legal strategies, on business strategies. He studied things like the Toyota production system and Eastern philosophy. It's so much more in depth than what he's known for is, OODA loop,
Mm.
which we could talk about later. But that's actually that's what my article today went out about, on the proper way, what I call the proper way to teach, or the more effective way to teach it. That's Boyd. McLuhan is usually reduced as well, like Boyd, and that was kind of maybe my attraction to McLuhan. He's reduced to the phrase, "the medium is the message," and that's
Mhm.
really all you're supposed to know about. Or you say he's a media theorist that helps us understand mass communication, which again is not nearly enough. What McLuhan is talking about in medium is technology and environment, and that all technology and all environment is technology is an extension of us, of some human system, like the wheel on the car or a bicycle is an extension of the foot. Because if I didn't have the bike or the car, I would have had to walk. Reading, and looking at you on the screen, and seeing the questions come up from Mark, and we have Wayne and everybody else that's on board. Welcome. But like that's an extension of my eye, that, the medium of my glasses is an extension of improving my sight, which is a sense. Um, McLuhan's work is more that those extensions of us have a direct effect and work us over completely. Like we're directly shaped by those things. So when you say that you're an elder millennial, I was commenting with somebody that had remarked on Substack earlier about Gen Zs, and Gen Zs are digital natives. You know, I have 4 Gen Z children, ages 16 to 21 with 2 in between. And they're digital natives. They don't know what it's like to live in a world without social media. They don't know what it's like to live in a world without an iPhone, without a smartphone, and taking pictures and you know, Yelp reviews and whatever, you know, whatever the hell else they're doing on their phones. But they don't understand that. But that technology has a direct effect on their being and who they are. McLuhan is really prescient and pertinent and worthy of study, because one of the things that he's most known for with the medium is the message is that he was quote unquote predicting the internet back in the 60s. And what he was really saying was that electronic media, electronic communications, that's an extension, all technology being an extension of our human systems, that electronic media is actually a extension of our central nervous system. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So imagine that type of technology. It's very different than, say, the hammer or the wheel or the printing press. Even it's overriding um our our central nervous systems and our thoughts and other things, and that's basically why a lot of people get shaped into tribes or groups or like advertising. You know, like why they fall for advertisements. I mean, he talks about that a lot. There's no shortage of stuff. I mean, we could do days and days. One of my mentors on this actually is Andrew McLuhan, who's Marshall McLuhan's grandson, and he's a good friend and collaborator. And he writes the McLuhan newsletter on Substack, and Andrew runs the McLuhan Institute. And yeah, he's been a tremendous mentor of understanding McLuhan better. But what I've learned and how Andrew and I got Andrew McLuhan and I got connected from Ed Brenegar. And Ed Brenegar has it's Brenegar, has a great leadership podcast and Substack. And Ed says, I got to connect you with this guy, Andrew McLuhan, or he had heard Andrew McLuhan talk and said, oh my gosh, you got to meet Mark McGrath, because there's a lot of synergy, I think, of what you're talking about with your grandfather, Marshall McLuhan, and what he's talking about with John Boyd. And then when we got together, we set up a Zoom for like, I don't know, 30-minute intro. Like 3 hours later, we realized that there was a lot more synergy to Boyd and McLuhan. And my takeaway was that if you understand Boyd, you'll understand Boyd and his applications even better if you understand McLuhan, and vice versa. If I understand Marshall McLuhan, and then I compound that with a more authentic understanding of John Boyd, then I'm going to be more effective in whatever it is I do, in whatever discipline, because I tell this to people all the time. John Boyd's work only applies where humans are making decisions, where humans are present and they're able to make decisions and make sense of their world. And at the same time, same with Marshall McLuhan. It only applies where humans are present, because all humans are engaged with media. Again, media being the Latin for, and I'm going to get smacked over the head by my teachers from yesteryear, but medium is the plural of media, being the technology and the environment, not what people would say, oh, Marshall McLuhan is a study in mass communications. Oh, Marshall McLuhan is a study in, you know, that's media. No, media is a lot more than just electronic media, which is a very good place to start talking about Marshall McLuhan, because a lot of his work is, as I said, is extremely prescient, and it ties right in with John Boyd and Teilhard and Hayek and others. So yeah, it's kind of John Boyd had this thing about creating snowmobiles, basically being this. You'll love this story. If you take a piece of paper, you cut it into 4 sections, and you put a skier on the slopes in one, a boat with an outboard motor, a bicycle, and a toy tank or a bulldozer, something with treads. And you could type in snowmobile on my Substack and it'll all come up. But basically what it was training people to do was how to shatter. Then this goes back to your question, like how do we orient and how do we reorient and how do we actually do this? Basically what Boyd was trying to show them, that if you can shatter the correspondence, if you could break everything down, you break all those components down, skier on the slopes, I think skis, poles, snow, and if bicycle, I think handlebar, seat, chain, and boat, I think gas engine, and I think toy tank, I think turret and tread or whatever. And I shattered all their correspondence to what it is that they actually are. And I don't think skier on the slopes anymore, but I'm left with all these other pieces. We should be able to synthesize things together that didn't currently exist, and that's
Mm-hmm.
through novelty. That's how we create mismatches. And then again, it ties back to what McLuhan is saying about new technology, how it has an effect on us. And well, Boyd would say, well, that's the novelty, showing us that we need to reorient, we need to update and revise our cognitive operating system, because if we don't do it, then we're going to become obsolete, we're going to become out of date, we're going to become static, and we're going to get bested by someone that can think of those things, that can see snowmobiles. And that was his definition of a winner versus a loser. A winner is someone that can make snowmobiles, and a loser was someone who cannot. But that's a kind of a rough way of saying like how we actually do it. But this is, I guess, even more to the point at a higher level. And this is another area where I intersect a lot with McLuhan. Boyd's fundamental starting point was called destruction and creation. And destruction and creation is depending on the version, 11 or 12 pages of very dense academic paper, with about 50 sources, where essentially what he's saying is, in order to improve our capacity for free and independent action, we have to shatter our models of what we think is going on in the world, because our cognitive understanding, that's the world, right? Like everything I think or believe or say or do, or what I belong to or where I'm from, all of that affects me, and all that is me. If I can't shatter that and destroy that and create new models, then I'm not going to be able to thrive and adapt. I'm not going to be able to adapt in the world. I'm not going to be able to survive, let alone adapt or thrive. That I have to be able to do that. I have to be able to break my models, and I have to be able to rewrite them as I go, because you mentioned earlier the term VUCA, like volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. Because everything's in motion, everything's always moving. I have to do that. If I don't, I'm going to be static. And one of the things that Ponch and I find in our work is that most people that teach UDA, or most people that think they understand Boyd, they have never read Destruction and Creation. In many cases, they've never heard of it. They certainly haven't looked at, if they haven't read that, and then they haven't read the work that surrounded it. And there's a great piece called by Chuck, last name is Spinney, Chuck Spinney. And I link to this. It's all, again, you type in Spinney on the world of reorientation, it's all over the place. He had a piece called Evolutionary Epistemology, which is his understanding of Boyd's destruction and creation. I'll be dead honest with you. I did not understand destruction and creation as well as I did until that piece came out and Chuck Spinney put it into terms that made more sense to me. And
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting about other consultants or groups that you hear teaching about Boyd, you ask them about, well, have you looked at Spinney? They've never heard of Chuck Spinney. And which is crazy, because he was Boyd's closest collaborator that actually helped him illustrate OODA Loop Sketch, which is, back to the comment that someone had made about OODA Loop being a model. OODA Loop Sketch is actually an illustrative abstraction of how our cognitive operating system functions in reality. And that's what Boyd was trying to tell us. That's what Boyd's teaching us, and that's what Chuck Spinney, who's still around, and I've had the good fortune to engage with. That's what he's also showing us, that the OODA loop is a illustrative map of how our orientation functions in reality as circumstances unfold, and how
Mm-hmm.
we sense within our environment, how we orient within our environment, how we come up with ideas, how we come up with novelty, how we test those ideas, all that occurring in reality. And it's not really a loop, because it's complex and simultaneous, and it happens in multiple dimensions. But ultimately, it's your interior game, like your inside mental game, your moral and mental game, that's going to have a direct connection to your physical game. But it's going to start in what you perceive and what you understand. And now I just said it back to, now I'm kind of bouncing back to McLuhan, right? That's where the perception comes into the discussion. With McLuhan talking about like how we perceive the world and how medium directly affects our perception. And well, Wood would say the same exact thing, that our perception is directly shaped by our orientation, who we are, where we're from, where we live, what we believe, what we think. All of that shapes how we see the world. So if you look at that tweet that I put in the comments, where a guy says, "Well, orientation is situational awareness, and for me, Uda is just the rest of it's just speed." And that's exactly what you want your competitors to run on, that it's just about speed. Because if it's just about power and speed, then Blockbuster would still be around, and they're not. And why? Because they had a disconnected view of reality. Their reality wasn't
Hmm.
connected, and that had a direct impediment on how they saw the world and how they operated within it. And they were really good at what they did. They were number one in everything until they no longer existed, and that happened violently and quickly because they didn't understand, inherently what Boyd's talking about, or even what McLuhan's talking about.
I mean,
I think I hit all the things that you said.
yeah, I mean, I took like 2 pages of notes while you were talking because there's just so many relationships in what you're saying. Um, I'm having a hard time picking up where to take it, but I think that this last thing that you said is the big one is that you change and transformation happen incredibly quickly in certain circumstances, and I think there are, I would say, a vast majority of especially uh, leadership. This is touching back to something else I said earlier, but a vast majority of leadership, in particular in enterprise environments, that do not understand that they're Blockbuster right now, and
Yeah.
like refuse to even entertain the idea that they're Blockbuster right now. And I think that that is a very loops back to this kind of next thing I wanted us to explore, which is like, you used a very provocative phrase, which I enjoy myself, is to shatter cognitive understanding. Um, which tied into a bunch of other things that got me really excited. Where I do want to go is shattering cognitive understanding. But before we go there, I got to ask you, you must have read Schumpeter if your master's is in economics. Like
Yeah.
creative destruction is the same thing, right? Like I think the thing is we're moving from a mechanistic to an ecological worldview. Is that one way I might put it? And as we have to move from that sort of mechanistic understanding of the world, we must shatter the worldview that enabled it to exist and sort of codified it. And as we do that, it's almost like we're going through, cognitive and cultural entropy. I know I've seen you write about that too. That got me really excited.
Hmm.
And in that entropy, that breaking down, you have, what were these sort of monolithic structures and ideas fragmenting into millions of little pieces as part of a transformation process. It's like, a butterfly or a caterpillar becomes goo before it becomes a butterfly. Like we're in the goo stage of transformation right now. And there's, billions of fragments of ideas and concepts just laying around everywhere. And when you have a capacity for like recombination and, making snowmobiles, this is like, a playground. It's incredible. But if you
Yeah.
don't have an orientation where you understand that you're swimming in all these fragments and that we're moving from mechanistic to ecological, or however you'd like to frame it, you don't, like, it's impossible to orient to reality as it actually exists. And I wonder, without going so deep into all the nerdy theorists that came up when I was listening to you, because there's so many of these models are the same. Like, yeah, so many. I have so many books on my shelf that are exact same ideas by different thinkers through different lenses. And that also makes me very excited. And so I wonder, and I'd love to reflect on this after you, but what have you seen about how those cognitive models get shattered? Like, what is the process people have to undergo? What is the process you use? What are the conditions? I think environment is a huge, huge, like, you have to have conditions. You have to be aware also that a part of a transformation process is regression. And so like how do we, how do you support people when they inevitably sort of, relapse, if you will, back into their old ways of seeing and doing?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, what are your thoughts on that part of it?
So again, there's a lot. You threw a lot at me again. So
Mark, this is the only
I'm
way. It's why we ended up an
I'm
hour and a half on
uh,
our 30-minute get
I'm
to know
gonna
you.
I'm gonna pull out the kitchen sink first.
Yeah.
So the concept of like change, right? I just put an article the other day about McLuhan. Communication has changed, right? When we communicate, and I'm learning about you and you learning about me. I mean, what's happening? We're reorienting, right? Like our cognitive operating system is updating. You're making me aware of things that I was not aware of. I'm telling you things that So our systems are destroying old models, and they're writing new ones. Um, as an economist, I mean, we could spend days talking about Schumpeter, but I'll just leave it at, yeah, all new creations, all novelty destroys something else. The car negates the need for horse and buggy. Um, the horse and buggy negated the need for, you know, riding a horse and like hauling all the stuff on just a horse, or just walking, or whatever. That we have to any technology. Again, I think this is what McLuhan is also saying too. Like any technology that has an effect on us, I mean, that's causing us to reorient, whether we want to or not. It's often done for us because of just by nature of just by nature of environment have an effect on us. And as McLuhan said, all media, uh, technology, and environment work us over completely. So those things are constantly changing us. I mean, look at all the different ways that we're communicating now. I mean, I'm looking at you through a lens that's going up to space and then back down to space in Vancouver, and then like connecting and then broadcasting out all over the world. You know, does that have an effect on us? Is that the message? And the answer is yeah. That's more important than the content that we're talking about. Um, what else did you say about, like the mechanistic to
The
ecological?
mechanism.
Yeah, I
Oh,
like
sorry.
that.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, like, when I think of Boyd and I think of orientation, I like to try to take out all of the mechanical metaphors as possible, because people are organic. Humans are organic. One of Boyd's uh, most powerful briefs, that's also not often referred to, is called Organic Design for Command and Control. And basically, what the genesis of that was that people were relying so heavily on technology to lead other people and to make decisions, that they were forgetting that there's a better way, and that's
Hmm.
doing it the human way. And I think that people forget that. So when you say the ecology, I mean, people are part of the ecology. People are
Yep.
organic. We're organic beings. We're not machines. When we look at when we look at, say, sort of a managerial view, we're looking at people as numbers. We're looking at people as contributors. We're looking at people as, spokes on a wheel, or, cogs in the system, versus humans with their own unique orientation. All orientations are unique, yet they can still be fractal. So you have an orientation, I have an orientation. We have one collectively as the conversationalists of this discussion. We're broadening that orientation to, when you look at all the people that have joined, right? That at some point, orientations are intersecting. Um, you know, you could go down to the individual, and this is another thing that Punch and I talk about a lot, that Boyd was trying to convey, that people don't understand about his work, is that orientation is fractal. So an organization has an orientation, a culture has an orientation, societies have orientation, a school has an orientation, alumni from a certain school have an orientation, but all those individuals still, they retain their own uniqueness. They retain their own orientation. I've had, again, the multidisciplinary nature of this, and having gone to, as I mentioned, educated by Jesuits. When people say, "Well, is orientation the soul?" You could certainly make that. You could certainly make that argument if you believe that your being, your energy, and that's part of your. Yeah, you could certainly to say that. The other thing about mechanistic and ecological, which just made me think of, is that both Boyd The work that I cited the other day about McLuhan talked about the difference between the Western approach and the Eastern
Mhm.
approach. And Boyd had um, a tremendous amount of Eastern philosophy injected into his work, looking at first and foremost Sun Tzu. I mean, he was a Sun Tzu's Art of War, which should be read by everybody, and no matter what you do. Um, Boyd said that's the one book he couldn't find any flaws with, and
Mm,
and he read, I don't know, 8 or 9 different translations of it.
mm.
And having been to the archive several times and held Boyd's books in my own hands, and I've put pictures of these up, his marginalia is extensive. And most of the marginalia is critical, like critiquing and finding fault or gaps for improvement. But the Sun Tzu works are not really like that. Like he did not find, as the one book, Art of War. In fact, we had a podcast with James Gimian, who wrote the book Rules of Victory, and Jim Gimian talks about how Sun Tzu is applicable, universally, and we certainly believe that too. But basically, kind of back to the point, like the Eastern and Western dynamic, I think are very different. Where the Western dynamic, which has been sort of the way of the world since the industrial age, that's very machinistic, it's very attrition based, it's very numbers based. Versus, I think the Eastern view is a little bit different. It's more like, how do we as beings integrate into a larger system. So when you look at the things that Boyd read, like the Bhagavad Gita and the Analects and the Tao, um, for those that are fans of Alan Watts, like
Love
on,
me some Alan Watts.
oh yeah, Alan Watts was um, if you look in Boyd's sources, Alan Watts is in there. Um, and that's again, that's I think that's the interior being versus versus the exterior being, versus um the visible things. There's like the invisible, it's all within you. um that's a dynamic, I think, that is probably more prevalent with Eastern philosophy than with, sort of, again, Western machinistic industrial age attrition.
We basically pretend in the West that there is no internal experience, and that it doesn't need to be developed, right? Like we put all of our emphasis, resources, time, energy into developing external technologies, external systems, perfecting, optimizing our productivity and all these things, while we largely deny that even optimizing productivity actually comes from your internal state. That's what
Yeah.
we work on it. So my friend's company that I'm joining is called Groundwork, and it's a system essentially for achieving what I might call peaceful productivity. It's like flow states are internally cultivated. They have a lot to do with your environment, but it's actually a set of internal resources and practices that you use. And
Yeah.
for some reason, we've divorced, I guess it's shifting now, for sure it's shifting. But when I think to even when I entered the workforce, or say when, my parents were going through the workforce, there was no acceptance that we were whole human beings with an inner world and emotions and experiences that, there's just even the fact that we have to separate parts of ourselves to go into a workplace. Like
Hmm.
I think that's actually a fundamental source of the stress epidemic, is that we're asking people to only bring parts of themselves forward in these certain environments.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hugest reckonings that we're going through, and one of the really fundamental parts of what it means to move from being mechanistic to being ecological is to remember that we're human beings. We're not parts of machines. Actually, there's been a lot on my mind. My most recent piece that's out, part 3 of a series that I wrote, which is poetically named. I need to shift my naming to being more pragmatic so people know what it's actually about. But the series is called Normal Zebras and Strange Horses and Futures Worth Living In. But part 3 is all about bureaucracy as the first AI. So like
Mm.
technologies are not just the thing, physical things we can see. Technologies are also our invisible systems of how we sort of, I talk about them as the systems that govern our lives. And when compare a definition of sort of what is AI to what is bureaucracy, like you can't help but go, those are the same things. And this is a technology, and we are, a lot of people in culture, the headlines, it's all about how AI is going to kill humans. And it's like, no, no, wait a sec. The system that first AI of bureaucracy is already killing us.
Yeah.
You know, by 2050, something like, I don't know, 70% of us are going to have cancer, autoimmune disease rates, like stress epidemic, disengagement at work. Like the statistics are endless and overwhelming that these bureaucratic systems are not working
Mm.
and they are, sort of strangling the life out of us. And
Hmm.
yet we're so worried about this, AI that's going to come and kill us. I talked about the paperclip problem. Do you know that one?
No. Paperclip problem.
Yeah, you like this. So it's a thought experiment from AI from Nick Bostrom. I can't remember if he's at MIT, but philosopher that largely works on in the technology space, and he came up with the paperclip problem to demonstrate the risk of an unchecked sort of rogue AI, where you give it a sort of neutral and benign and maybe even seemingly pro-social core instruction,
Hmm.
make paperclips, and if left unchecked, all of a sudden, it's extracted every last resource on the earth in its pursuit of making paperclips, including the human resources that it required to produce them. And so he uses that as a way of helping us see what the dangers are. And what I argued in my piece was no, no, we're already living the paperclip problem. We optimized this AI that we call bureaucracy for a singular goal of make as much profit as possible.
Hmm.
And we required human resources to do that. We required physical resources to do that. We took this mechanistic worldview and we said, nature doesn't have value unless it can be extracted and turned into profit, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think part of why I got super excited about your work is because this stuff is very big on my brain right now. And the Guardians of Decay was the other thing that really spoke to
Oh,
me in your work, because the Guardians are protecting the bureaucracies.
yeah.
They're the ones that are protecting this AI that is demonstrably anti-human. Like,
Yeah.
and none of us did this on purpose. This isn't like some political critique of any particular, like capital. No, no, it's just like really literal.
They're
It's
they're
very
everywhere.
literal.
Yeah, they're in any
Yeah.
institution, right, left, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Can you
Religious,
explain them?
secular. So originally I had this thing years ago, and again, you can find this on the Whirl about SQDs, like status quo defenders, right? And it came from my time in asset management of just realizing that so many people, all they would rather do is just enforce the status quo versus actually
Mhm.
make any change. And the status quo defenders, like the defense of the status quo, I don't think gave them it wasn't a memorable enough name as Guardians of Decay. And I think Guardians of Decay, like once you see them, you can't unsee them. And they're either willing or unwilling or witting or unwitting, that they're the ones that are maintaining the bureaucracy because they're violating ultimately what John Boyd said was they're choosing to be over to do. Um, Boyd pointed out that he would sit down a young officer and he would say, you're going to come to a crossroads. You can be or do. And if you're going to be, you're going to get all the promotions. You're going to get all the, you're going to get all the accolades. Everybody's going to like you. You're going to be considered a team player. And if you're going to do, then you're going to make change and you're going to bring in new designs and new thinking, and you're going to piss everybody off and everybody's going to hate you and they're going to run you out and they're going to throw you out. I always like to use the example of Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs was a to-do guy, I think. And
Mhm.
and when he started Apple in his garage, it was to do, right? We're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. They build up Apple, and the next thing you know, they have all this money, and the guys that are around them are pissed off because they'd rather just enjoy their money and drive their cars and live in their big homes that they never had before. But Jobs is like, he's not satisfied. We got to keep going. We got to keep going. Got to keep doing. And then they threw him out, until they did. And they brought him back because, again, they had spent so much time, I think, being versus doing. But that's an important thing to understand about the Guardians. Like they're the ones that choose to be over to do. Actually, see that he's on the live stream here, and I've linked to his articles. But Brett McKay has the two best articles that I send anybody that knows nothing of John Boyd. They should go to read Brett McKay's articles on the art of manliness. One is called The Tao of Boyd, and the other one is called Boyd's Roll Call, which is to be or to do. And what it talks about is what I just said, is that you're at that crossroads I'm just going to be like everybody else, or I'm going to upset the apple cart, or I'm going to be able to, make change. I'm going to reduce my needs to zero. I'm willing to be unpopular or whatever, because I'm actually bringing fundamental change to the world. That's it's John Boyd 101. But I think it also too, it plays right into why Boyd, who fought the Guardians of Decay his entire time, um, that's really an example of to be and to do. The Guardians, they want to be. They don't want to upset the herd. They don't want to upset the apple cart. They don't want to be. They'd rather be wrong in the group than right on their own. And then what ends up happening is they become enforcers for bureaucracies. They become enforcers for obsolete systems. I mean, we could spend days thinking of all the things that just don't need to exist anymore. And why are they there? Well, there's Guardians of Decay. There's some other characters I talk about, the Merchants of Certainty, and the Merchants of
Yep.
Certainty are those types of consultants that are going to go in and help the Guardians of Decay maintain the status quo. They're gonna help them with their I say slides, slogans, and surveys. They're gonna ferret out and rid them of anybody that was innovative, that was bringing change. And it does come to that sort of, like you say, of bureaucracy being an AI. And I think, in fact, I sent you Ludwig von Mises's book, Bureaucracy. That's the best book
Yep.
on bureaucracy ever written,
Yep.
my opinion. But, they're everywhere. They're in every industry, every sector, every school, every township board, every school board, every um, um, kids swim club. I'm just thinking of things like my own experience, with Guardians of Decay, that because they don't want their position to be disturbed, whereas others would say, "Hey, my time is finite. I am not on this earth permanently, and while I'm here, I'm going to make a tremendous impact and do things." That's John Boyd. That's Marshall McLuhan. That's Teilhard de Chardin. That's Friedrich Hayek. That's Steve Jobs, Michael Jordan. Anybody, we got on the list of people that chose to do versus to be. Anyway, what else do we? Did I unpack everything? Let's see. Oh, I was just talking to Andrew McLuhan this morning about figure and ground, and that was one of the things that I had written about the other day when I wrote that article about his grandfather, like basically throwing the org chart. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying about systems. I had asked him, I said, it's a figure and ground. So basically, again, this is a very rough description, but figure is what we can see, and ground are the fundamental landslides and things like that we don't see, but we see the symptoms. The symptoms are the figures. That's the way I explained it. But that's not what's important. What's important is actually the societal changes, or the bigger, broader changes. Another way to say, like, the invisible over the visible. One of my favorite books of all time is by Henry Hazlitt. It's called Economics in One Lesson. And here's all of economics in one lesson. There's what you can see, and there's what you can't see. And what you see is a direct result of what you can't see. And if you don't think about what you can't see, then all you're going to do is you're going to get completely rolled and controlled by the things that you can see. Like you were kind of talking about it, like, well, people are doing this just for profit, or people are doing this for whatever. But like, they're not thinking of the bigger things at play, the bigger systems, the bigger forces at play. But again, we could. I don't know if you want to do an economics show some other time, but we could.
Yes, I haven't got to think and talk about Schumpeter in a while. I wrote a very fun paper in university for my favorite prof about, he had us take on a subject from the perspective of three different economists. His historic, he said, dead or alive, and he had us sort of like interview them. And so I picked Keynes, Schumpeter, and oh my gosh, can't remember the anyway, it'll come to me. It doesn't matter. But yeah, Schumpeter, love him. I think he is one of those very prescient theorists who, I think guys like him, McLuhan, et cetera, other academics that I think even yourself, what a lot of them are doing when they're allowed is they're observing the world as they see it actually working. Whereas other theorists who have sort of dominated economics, at, and the models that we use today, and even actually the way that we theorize bureaucracy, all of it was theoretical. It was like top down versus bottom up, It was, this is the way the world should work under ideal circumstances, largely divorced from the actual reality of the way it does work. And I think that what makes someone threatening to a guardian of decay is when they see the dynamics much more clearly and understand how to innovate inside of those dynamics or how to move things forward inside of the world as it actually exists. And I find, yeah, I'm not getting to a particular conclusion, but I do think it's very interesting the difference between having ideas about the way things should be that aren't landed in, reality, and then actually describing reality as it is. And I find those folks are also very autodidactic. Like they're not of the system, and even if they are of the system, they're the, heterodox thinker, they're the divergent, they're the one who's willing to see it differently, as you say, to I can't remember how you phrased it, but something about not having needs, and just that willingness to say, I will diverge from what's expected from this cultural. I talk about the cultural immune system as kind of my thinking that lines up with Guardians of Decay. Like Guardians of Decay are the ones who enact the cultural immune system, and the cultural immune system job is like spit out anybody who is, like the foreign invaders
Uh,
of the system who are there to threaten it, um, even if
yeah,
they
the
might
system
actually be really needed.
it'll defend itself. That
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing about the Guardians of Decay. Obsolete systems will fight to the death, to preserve their relevance, even when there is no more relevance. I also think too. I mean, it's. I was talking about this on another podcast that I was a guest on last week about how we're taught. There at one point, the standard for education was a very broad generalist education, that included arts, letters, and science and math. Like it was broad. It wasn't limited. It wasn't specialized. And thus people were basically being formed as a whole person to engage in the whole world, versus over specialization, which Buckminster Fuller, who's another, one of my massive influences. I love Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller said that in the future, all specialists were going to be replaced by automation, you know,
Yeah.
that, trying to think of an example. I forget where this comes from, and maybe if we Google it, we could figure it out. But the the way it was explained to me is like the koala, because this occurs in nature. The koala bear is the ultimate specialist. If it doesn't have access to eucalyptus trees, the right temperature, the right climate, it'll die. In other words, like I couldn't take a koala, I couldn't steal a koala from Australia and bring it back to my native Pennsylvania and like turn it loose in the forest. Like it would never live at all, right? But I could do that with rats, right? I could take a rat, like a rat, and on the other hand, is the ultimate specialist. I was stationed in Hawaii. Guess what? There was rats. I was here in New York City. Guess what? There's rats, right? Like the rats are the ultimate adapters that can go anywhere, versus the koala being a very natural, specialist. Well, the moral of the story was that this person was telling us, I can't remember who it was, but that if we become too specialized, we're limited in the environments that we can thrive in. We're limited in the environments that we can function in. And if we're not flexible, if we're too bureaucratic, if we become guardians of decay, then we're going to be out of our element at some point, and we're going to not only fail, but we're going to be defeated. We're going to be. That's where Boyd would say. And by the way, Boyd's snowmobile. Back to remember, I was talking about the fusion of things to synthesize with snowmobiles. His snowmobile was three things. It was the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, that all,
Yep.
and then Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or also known as the indeterminacy principle, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And then, in a nutshell, you constantly have to be putting new energy into things because the universe is uncertain and we can never have complete information, right? So
Mm,
that's why we reorient. That's why we shatter our models. That's why we constantly revise and update our understanding of the world, because of those three things that suggest that we live in a universe that's always in motion, always changing, always dynamic. That's sort of the requirement of, even where the name of the Substack comes from, the world of reorientation, and the podcast No Way Out. What Boyd was saying, that because of entropy and uncertainty and all these other things, there's no way out of the world of reorientation,
mm.
because if we don't do those things, we're dead.
Yep.
We
Yep.
can't live.
Yep. So I'm also tracking our time because we said we'd be about 90 minutes today, and so
Yep.
we have about 20 left, and we have gotten so excited onto so many different branches that we haven't actually drilled into the something that I really want to hear you speak on, which is back to that how do we, like, what are the very tangible, practical interventions, practices, strategies for how people reorient and constantly reorient and be adaptive in a time of transformation. And maybe let's just, this isn't quite right, but I'll paint it this way. Like, let's say there's a spectrum from sort of a more static, kind of rigid guardian personality to a highly adaptive personality. How does someone on this side of the spectrum start to develop themselves to move to the other side of the spectrum?
When I used to teach this, and how I used to get to do keynote speeches, everybody was hot on the topic of VUCA. You mentioned it. You mentioned it earlier, and
Mm.
put VUCA in on the Whirl, and everybody can read. Everybody can read the article that I wrote about it. It's so basic and fundamental. It's just that basically the universe is always in a state of change, right? It's always in a state of becoming. It's always moving. And what I kind of, in the old days, I used to break it down three ways. Like, this was like, I'm going to bare bones this thing. I'm going to talk to people that know nothing of John Boyd. They know nothing of complexity science. They know nothing. They've never heard of the Santa Fe Institute or whatever. Um, and like I said, the first thing I would do is I'd just tell people, go read Brett McKay's articles and then come back to me. But if they wouldn't even do that, I would start kind of a 1, 2, 3. I would say, number one, the universe is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's always in
Mm.
a state of change. It's always in a state of becoming. You have to understand and accept that. You cannot make it go away. You cannot change it. You can't stop it. You can't eradicate it. It's always going to be volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what I used to use was the Hubble Deep Field. And I would show, now you have the James Webb Telescope Deep Field, and like these little tiny, like a grain of sand holding it up to the sky. Inside that equivalent of a grain of sand over a constellation, there's something like 3,000 galaxies no one ever knew existed before. And it's just saying that the state of the universe is this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous state of being that never changes, never goes away. That was number one. Number two was our orientation, our cognitive being, our what's speaking to you now, what's receiving me, what's filtering all that out. That is our orientation. Everybody has one. They're all unique to them. And they're fractal in the sense that I can form together as a team, a Marine Corps, a basketball team, a podcast interview, whatever it is, right? We can intersect orientations, but it's unique. But orientation is how I, as Mark McGrath, function in that volatility, uncertainty, and complex ambiguity. And then the third part was OODA loop sketch. OODA loop sketch is the illustrative abstraction of how that orientation functions inside of VUCA. And if I understand OODA loop sketch and I understand how it empowers me to sense, decide, act, and learn in this unfolding reality, I'm going to be better off than people that don't understand it. I'm going to be better off than people that are over specialized. I'm going to be better off than people that say, oh, it's just about speed. Everything's about speed, or everything's just about money, or everything's just about force, or everything's just about power. I'm going to be better off because I'm going to be able to see things differently than they are, faster than they are. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to be able to revise my understanding faster than they are. And ultimately, if everything goes right, be successful and improve my own capacity for free and independent action. Like
Mm.
that's the sort of the rudimentary, 1, 2, 3. I have to accept that the universe is VUCA. I have to understand that how I interact with my universe, the universe, is through orientation, and that orientation functions the way it's depicted in the illustrative abstraction known as OODA loop sketch, which was a discovery of John Boyd. And I believe these things to be axiomatic. So people would say, well, I wouldn't use OODA loop in here. Not in this certain situation. That's completely farcical, because you're taking things that are axiomatic and a priori, and you're trying to say that I only use it in certain situations. But even just saying that, I can still explain everything that you just did through those terms. And again, that we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole, it's all on the website. But yeah, that's essentially, those were sort of the three things that how to get people to understand that stuff. Or read that article that I tagged in there, John Boyd 101, like how to start asking those questions. I mean, I was born a contrarian. I was a natural contrarian. I was a pariah to a lot of people growing up. And it's odd for an oldest of three, who's the son of an army officer that went to West Point. It's odd for me to be I guess, a radical thinker, but I was like something never satisfied me. Like there was always something. I always thought there was more to the story on something. Like I always thought that there was another way to explain something, or there were other ways to look at something. Like I never bought into, you know, official stories. The other thing, I was back to application and understanding. Just think of the ocean, and that's my primary natural obsession, is the ocean. The ocean is always in a state of becoming. It's never the same twice. It's always moving. It has tides and currents, and it has depths that are still unexplored. And it can be, when I was at sea in the military, it can be in the middle of the ocean and be like glass, like glass. And then within hours, it could be trying to kill you, with,
Mhm.
big waves. But it's always in a state of change and becoming, and it's so unpredictable, but I can understand enough about it and how to function in it, but I can never know exactly everything. And that's why I have to keep breaking and rewriting my models, which, by the way, that's what Boyd did. Boyd believed that if he wrote a book, it would be ossified, it would calcify, it would only be for that moment, it wouldn't be for what's becoming. So all of his work is done through briefings and oral culture versus versus books and textbooks and things like that. He had a different approach. But
Got to do things differently to get different outcomes, which is, I think, like, you briefly touched into sort of education and learning, which was sort of where I got my start, was in thinking about how do we transform education.
yeah,
And I just did this big deep dive on the weekend about sort of, globally, multidisciplinarily, what are all of the models of how transformation happens, and who says what about them from what disciplines, et cetera. And then from that, took it and sort of tried to find the universal through lines, like what is common to almost every description of how transformation occurs and what it is. And one of them is you have to start by telling the truth,
yeah.
which is what I'm hearing in voice work, which is very interesting.
Well, one of
Um,
the first things, like Ponch says this a lot, like one of the first times, like when we're engaging with a company or a client, I have a lot of, CEOs where I just advise them, and, then I help them build an internal component, and they do it themselves in their companies. But a lot of them will come at us and they'll say, like, well, here's where we want to be at the end of the year. Here's where we want to be in 5 years. And we tell them, stop, because you don't know where you are right now. And you've not made sense of this to understand exactly, or close enough to understand where you are. And if you don't know where you are, there's no way you can, all the places you could say we're going to do X, Y, and Z, it doesn't matter. You're never going to get there because, you don't know where you're at. By the way, I'm going to switch over to, put my power cord in because I see that I'm about to die here.
yeah, great. Well, we also just about 10 minutes or so left as well.
Can you still hear me?
Um, yeah, I got you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. Now it's plugged into power. I'll just have to reorient. So,
Yeah, good, good.
but yeah, I mean, that's what people don't understand, is that, merchants of certainty will say, "Hey, okay, you want to get there in 5 years? Here's where we're going to get you in 5 years."
Mhm.
Well, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't
Mhm.
work like that. Put the power forward way through here, back where I had you. It doesn't, it's like I have to know where I'm at. Um, but even Boyd said so. Boyd channeling Heisenberg says, even if I know where the one point is, there's no way I could with certainty tell you where the next point is. That's the nature of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. There we go.
Absolutely, and part of my interest in education was going through a transformative experience in my undergrad and being like, what the fuck are we actually doing in education when we're just sitting people down to listen and regurgitate the world as it's supposed to exist but doesn't in most disciplines? And so
Yeah.
I think that there's when we think about how do you be in a VUCA world or the need to be able to tell the truth to have transformation, or even I popped another article in the chat as well about the Banny framework, which is an evolution of VUCA, to say like no, things have gotten a lot more complex to the point where, and I want to get this right, I believe that this gentleman theorized it as anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And that to me is, yeah, it's an evolution of VUCA that doesn't challenge what we're saying, but sort of gets even degrees more honesty. Like I think um, VUCA, the way you're talking about it, is very much it's part of the truth telling. It's part of the honesty of like are we? And these very static, old, big, slow, bureaucratic institutions like universities, which is where I was doing my future of education work, um, they start by not allowing you to tell the truth about what's actually going on. And then we're putting students through, this rigorous training for a world that doesn't actually exist. And so there are so many points where we need to not just shift, but back to the idea of transformation as a before and after, actually transform these various systems that are meant to develop humans and take care of society as a whole and ideally produce good and better outcomes for everyone. uh, we have to start from the honesty that that's not actually what they're doing, and that the environment and system they're operating in is now, not just subject to these sort of laws of physics that are represented by VUCA, but also now we're in this like even sort of exponential, or I saw someone recently talk about factorial age where everything, I think this is part of the entropy and the breakdown is brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. It's a very challenging moment to try to make sense of.
Mhm.
Um, and I wonder, just in the couple minutes that we have left, is um, just any sort of final reflections from you about what it's like to try to help people make sense of this moment
Well,
at a more human level, like what you observe with clients and this type of
yeah,
thing.
people don't want to be wrong, right? And they want to belong to something. Um, people want to. They don't necessarily want to challenge, um, you know, the stories, the stories they've been told. Like they were told, maybe they were told a story their whole life that they were X, Y, and Z, and then one day they took a DNA test and they realized no, they're not.
Yeah.
Because there's a new understanding. And then you have to be able to let that, you have to be able to let that go and move on because your beliefs aren't necessarily true, and they're always in a state of becoming, right? Like they're always in, like me at 30, uh, at 39, which I'm not. That was 10 years ago. Um, saw the world a whole lot differently than I do now at 49, right? And that might be an interesting segue to talk about the three ways that you would only change a orientation, and they all begin with D. One is drift, that just through the passing of time, my orientation shifts. Because in my 49 years on Earth, I've gone from rotary phones to talking to you through a device that I thought was only possible on Star Trek. or Star Wars or whatever. And I'll say Star Wars because I was not a Star Trek fan. I did watch the movies, but I did not watch the TV show. Um, but like, I guess what I'm saying is that over time, just things change, right? We age and things change. The other two are kind of how I coach people. Like you have to put them in conjunction. So there's disruption and there's design. If I disrupt your orientation, then it's one thing. I'll change your orientation by disrupting it. So I always would use the example of a high school kid getting on a bus in the middle of the night and getting let off at San Diego or Parris Island, South Carolina at Marine Corps Recruit Depot. And that all that high school drama and big man on campus, whatever it was, in an instant, that will be disrupted and eradicated right out of you from the minute you set foot there, because the disruption is so severe. Whatever you thought the world was, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And at the same time, rather than just disrupt people, because if you just disrupt people, you're just creating chaos. The third D is design. So take back to the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps shatters someone's correspondence to reality, and that entire 90 days that they're there, they're constantly meeting that disruption with design. So as you disrupt one part of orientation, there's design with the other. They're being reoriented the entire time, because you're meeting the disruption with design.
That is good. Interestingly, all of the transformation models require disruption. So it's
Yeah,
like truth telling, disruption to a status quo, and then I can't remember what basically the sort of entropic period where things are more chaotic, more less known, and then there's typically like an emergence and a reestablishment of a new status quo is sort of the shorthand of most of the ones that I was looking at. And yeah, so that's very interesting, meeting disruption with design. Huh.
yeah. It's like, I mean, there's countless examples, right? But you think of like just all the technology that at some point the technology that we're using was disruptive, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it disrupted something else. Well, if it disrupted to the point of just destroying something, that's fine. But then there's other ways that most people that were selling me something were disrupting my correspondence to whatever it was and meeting me with the design of whatever it is that they had.
Mm.
That's why I use Apple and not Android, or that's why I use, I like to drink Coke over Pepsi. I mean, I'm just using, general examples that aren't necessarily true because I don't drink Coke or Pepsi. But I have to, if you're using, if you're a Coke drinker and I want to get you to be, and I work for Pepsi, I have to shatter your correspondence. I have to disrupt that bond between you and Coke.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to disrupt that with meaning. I have to disrupt that with purpose. I have to disrupt that with
Mm.
design that will make you want to come over and drink Pepsi.
So
Does that make sense? Like, I mean, anybody that's selling you something has to disrupt. You have to disrupt in design. Like that just like Substack is a disruption of like I hate LinkedIn, right? Like, I mean, like Substack came and disrupted my understanding of things, and then I realized the design of Substack. Hey, this is a place where you can have a community, and this you can talk, and you can actually do what LinkedIn was supposed to do. You can actually network, you can actually have conversations. You can actually do what LinkedIn was like designed for. Um, but that that disruption met with that design. That's why I made the switch.
yeah, so for me, that's very, very clear. And the first place my brain goes is the place we didn't get to go yet. So maybe we have to have a part two. But one of the places that I know this pattern the best and is in from psychedelic transformation. So a
Yeah.
psychedelic comes in, it's the disruptor. It disrupts the neural pathways and all the things you think that you know. And that is not the part that actually transforms you. The part that actually transforms you is the design that gets met with it, the design of your life. So integration. The integration process is where the real transformation happens. It's when the caterpillar, becomes goo and then reforms as the butterfly. The reformation is the integration. And I think that really why I think we probably share, both of us, an integration or an interest in psychedelics, is because it is part of they contribute to these transformation processes in a huge and meaningful way. And I think that when, a psychedelic doesn't work, or somebody, maybe goes and has a profound experience, and then 3 months later, their life looks exactly the same as before. What I think I've learned, and largely through one of my best friends is an integration therapist, is that they skipped the integration part. They did the disruption part, but didn't meet it with a design to support the shift that happened internally. And so you can have this profound transformation of your worldview, or whatever, your experience of life. But if you just get dragged back into the current of your own life, you're going to be back where you started for the most part. And so what is the design that you're going to meet with, so that you actually can implement whatever internal change occurred for you, and
Hmm.
even to remember it. And so, yeah, maybe that's a interesting place to leave it. Maybe there's a part two where we go on psychedelics, because I think you have some really interesting perspectives on that too.
I mean, you could type in the word psychedelic on the World of Reorientation, as we're my business partners and I mean, we're a service disabled veteran owned small business, and we have a different view than many. And we don't advocate the recreational use, but we advocate the exploration of psychedelics as therapy for trauma,
Yep.
not limited to veterans. Veterans trauma is not unique to veterans. Trauma can go in a lot of different directions, but we've had about, I don't know, 7 or 8 different guests on the podcast talking about how, psychedelic therapies have been a, an area that's worthy of exploring. That's providing a lot of, legitimate, I don't know, like the neuroplasticity changes or whatever, like whatever that psychotropics do, psychedelics don't do, or vice versa. And it gives people a different experience. And we had Norman Ohler on, who wrote the book Tripped, and he's author, and he talked about how the Albert Hoffman, when he created LSD, I mean, it was like a one-time mental health drug, like a one-time use mental health drug. Um, Back to your point earlier about profit, where's the profit in that, right? How do we get people hooked? It's not like cornflakes, right? We get them eating cornflakes every day.
Yep.
The design of those things, I think, are very different. I mean, I, I have to admit, it was Ponch that helped me understand it better when we first started talking, like psychedelics. Like, I mean, what my knowledge of psychedelics were, well, that's why we have Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Pet Sounds. So I guess, that's great. But, you know, for treating PTSD, and the more I learned about it, I think also too, I'd let any other veteran answer for themselves, but I know too many people that took their own lives from trauma, that, combat was no match for whatever it is that they held in their head, that they decided to end it all. One of my closest friends, from the Marine Corps, I mean, he swallowed an entire bottle of the pills they were prescribing him, and, and he passed from it, on his own recognizance. And, the more you learn about psychedelics, and the more we've talked about different people, and we've had different people on the show to talk about the value of psychedelics in certain therapeutic uses. And you hate to think that, like, boy, they were one trip away from healing, finding the healing that they needed. I also think too, like following Boyd and, the other things I was telling you about, like, I could go into it with a lot of predisposed biases, probably, like, me 20 years ago. Sure. Like, psychedelics, that's for hippies. That's for druggies and, whatever. But, like, having the experience through time, right? Passing time as a veteran that's known a lot of guys that have taken their own lives, to seeing as an alternative therapy to help people, with their mental health. Yeah, I think that's certainly, uh, not only valid, but, like, kind of probably the right thing to do. um,
Yeah.
we've had on the show, guys that, have gone over to Mexico to get treated and talk about that experience, but they can't do it in, Nebraska or wherever the heck they live. They have to get in a plane and go to Mexico because it's authorized down there. It's legal down there. Even for the therapeutic use. Like anything else, there's abuse, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think it was George Harrison talking about it. I saw there's some video like somebody put in his coffee, and then they came up with I don't know, Rubber Soul or Revolver, or one of them. Like they like it was just like wow. But what he was talking about then, they didn't just use it once, they used it more and more, and I think that that probably has like, the recreational use has a very adverse effect, and it, um, I had an article about Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson is one of my favorites of all time, and he was the movie night recommendation last week, the movie about him, but you can see, like, the chronic use of those things has a probably has an adverse effect, while maybe a early intervention therapeutic thing might have a better value, but it did give us Pet Sounds, which my 3 favorite songs of all time come from 2 of them come from that album. So,
Yeah,
and by the
super,
way,
so many layers.
the 3rd favorite song is also Brian. I mean, I have to think of all the songs. I keep coming down to, Good Vibrations, God Only Knows, and Wouldn't It Be Nice, you know? And, they're all Brian Wilson songs, and he was probably tripping when he wrote it.
Yep.
So, anyway.
Yeah, so much stuff in there, and hey, I'm very, very sorry about your friend, and I've lost a friend that way, and it's fairly it's a whole real, real painful thing. So I'm very sorry for that loss,
That's
and
good. It's good to know that it's become more, you know, I mean, I live in Manhattan, right? Cannabis is not only legal, it's everywhere. Like, it's like you walk out of an office building, or yeah, you're looking around like office buildings where you would think like, commerce is occurring or whatever, and everybody's high. Um, which is funny, everything's kind of mellow. Like, the Manhattan of my childhood is not the Manhattan that I live in now. It's so much more mellow. I just wonder if it's because like there's this waft from secondhand high everywhere. But I mean, things change. Go back to orientation, right? Things change. I mean, people have a different understanding of things, and things become, more culturally acceptable, or more, maybe like a broader understanding. And I think that's one of the, back to the medium being the message. That's one of the cool things about the internet, and the cool things about our digital connectivity, is that we can learn a lot more than we could um, when I was a kid. I had to go to the library and get the card catalog, and I had to, hopefully the book was available. If not, I had to wait for it. Things have, there's a lot of positive changes with it too. It's not all, I don't think it's all
absolutely,
negative. Yeah.
yeah,
But anyway.
absolutely. Well, I'm really sad I have to cut us off because I have a next thing, and
Yep.
yeah,
Same.
but this was so great, Mark. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate you. This has been a really stimulating, interesting conversation. Appreciate your work, and yeah, maybe we'll have to do a part 2 to get into that psychedelic stuff.
Yeah, check out our interviews on the No Way Out podcast. They're all available on our Substack, The World of Reorientation, and just type in psychedelics, and you'll see interviews with Norman Ohler and others about the topic, about the therapeutic uses of it. Yeah, but yeah, of course, John Boyd, Marshall McLuhan, and everything else that we talked about. So,
Awesome.
yep,
Very
thanks for
cool.
having me
Very
too.
cool.
And yep,
Yeah, thank you too. Okay, take good care. We'll see you on Substack.
thank you.
Yeah, okay. Bye.
Bye.
And thanks everyone who came and had a conversation with us. Really appreciate that. Just
Abs-
I'm
Absolutely.
still building up my muscles around hosting these things, but it's very cool and exciting to see, 37 folks here largely with us through the whole thing. So really appreciate you guys, and yeah, try to get better over time at including you and making this more of a dialogue. So appreciate you being here too. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Yeah.